we're really getting into the weeds on Intel. Such a foundational company, right, for AI, semiconductors, the whole landscape.
Absolutely. And we're drawing heavily from an analysis by the Chisme Corporativo podcast, which gives a great sort of business-centric view.
Yeah, they really dug into the history. So our plan today is basically to pull out the key stuff from their the big moments, the reasons behind where Intel is now.
You know, you almost have to start with Intel if you want to understand modern AI. It's not just about the chips, it's the hardware foundation they built.
Okay, let's jump right in. The analysis kicks off with the Traitorous 8. Intriguing name. What's the story there?
Right, so this was 8 key people leaving Shockley Semiconductor, dissatisfied with the management, basically.
And this led to Fairchild Semiconductor.
Exactly, and 2 huge names were in that group, Robert Noyce and Gordon Moore.
Robert Noyce, the mayor of Silicon Valley. That tells you something. His contribution sounds massive.
Oh, completely. He's credited with inventing the silicon integrated circuit, the microchip.
Which was different how?
Well, unlike earlier attempts, his could be mass-produced. Didn't need tons of external wires. Absolutely vital for the PC revolution later on.
And Silicon Valley itself comes from his patent.
Yeah, his 1961 patent for that silicon circuit. Pretty direct link.
Then Gordon Moore, also a legend, co-founder, philanthropist.
And of course, Moore's Law, 1965, that famous prediction.
Can you recap that quickly?
Sure. He predicted that the number of transistors you could fit on a chip would roughly double every 2 years, while the cost would basically halve. And he thought that trend would hold for like at least a decade.
And it wasn't just an observation, was it? The podcast stressed it became Intel's strategy.
It really did. Kind of self-fulfilling prophecy.
Wow.
Though the analysis points out its accuracy has gotten, well, more complicated over time.
How so?
Well, initially it was all about making transistors smaller, shrinking them down. But, you hit physical limits. Now it's more nuanced capability increases. But maybe not just from size reduction alone. Chip architecture matters more.
Okay, and the third big name, Andy Grove. His personal story is incredible. Holocaust survivor, escaping Soviet Hungary.
Truly remarkable. Arrived in the U.S. with almost nothing. Language barriers, even a significant hearing impairment from childhood illness.
Wow.
And still graduated top of his class in chemical engineering. That resilience, you have to think, it shaped his whole management approach.
Only the paranoid survive. That book title says a lot.
It does. He preached constant vigilance. A real fear of the competition. Keep looking over your shoulder.
The source highlights this interesting mix, right? He pushed for open offices, flatter structures, very Silicon Valley now, but was also known for being demanding, confrontational.
Yeah, the podcast captures that tension. He helped create that open, collaborative vibe, but he also believed in what he called creative confrontation, pushing people hard to solve problems. It was definitely part of his style.
So before Intel, all this talent converged at Fairchild Semiconductor. Why was Fairchild so important?
Well, it was born directly from Noyce, Moore, and the others leaving Shockley, set up as a division of Fairchild Camera and Instrument.
And that's where Noyce invented his silicon chip.
Yes, right there. Around the same time, Jack Kilby at Texas Instruments developed one using germanium.
But the silicon was the key difference.
Huge difference. Noyce's design put everything, connections included, on the silicon. That allowed for miniaturization and, crucially, mass production. Kilby's was revolutionary but didn't scale the same way.
And NASA was their first big customer. That must have been huge.
It really was. Remember, this was post-Sputnik. Huge pressure in the U.S. space race. NASA needed smaller, lighter components for things like the Apollo navigation computer.
So Noyce's chips were perfect.
Exactly. Smaller, lighter. The podcast makes a neat comparison to SpaceX's early reliance on government contracts, too. Similar dynamic.
And that NASA demand just fueled incredible growth.
Like crazy. Small team to 1,000 people in 2 years. Revenue exploded $500,000 to $21 million by 1960. That's hundreds of millions today.
And this is where Grove comes in. But he wasn't hired immediately.
Right. The podcast mentioned he actually got turned down initially. But then, 1963, Fairchild needed more chemical engineers because of the NASA work. Berkeley recommended Grove, and they hired him.
And he connected with Moore right away.
Yeah, apparently they hit it off immediately. A really important relationship, obviously.
What fascinates me, though, is Noyce's vision. Even with NASA knocking, he was thinking bigger.
Totally. He saw the potential for a civilian market, even though it didn't really exist yet. He actually turned down some military research contracts.
Really? Why?
To keep control of their tech roadmap, focus on things that could eventually be used commercially. Very forward-thinking.
But the challenge was cost, right? Making chips affordable.
Exactly the hurdle. By 65, though, Fairchild, with more leading development, got really good at low-cost manufacturing, became the dominant player. Moore's Law in action, really.
But defense money was still significant for a long time.
Well, yeah. Even in 75, defense was like 72% of demand. Intel's later genius was finding those dual uses, tech developed for defense, applied to the booming civilian market.
The source also mentioned something interesting about the early workforce, women playing a big role.
Yeah, that was fascinating. A large part of the assembly and testing workforce at Fairchild were women, partly attributed to, well, smaller hands being better for the delicate work.
And maybe lower wages, too.
Potentially, yeah. And Fairchild was early in setting up factories in Asia as well.
Okay, so things are humming at Fairchild, but then the seeds for Intel get planted. What was the trigger?
Equity, or lack thereof. The employees, especially Noyce and Moore, realized they didn't have the stock options, the ownership stake, that other Valley companies were starting to offer.
Despite doing this revolutionary work.
Right. That frustration was a huge driver. So they decided to leave and start their own thing. Integrated Electronics Corporation, Intel, July 18th, 1968.
And they weren't just relying on investors, they put their own skin in the game.
Big time. Raised $2.5 million from investors, but Noyce and Moore each put in $250,000 of their own money. That's serious cash back then. Shows how much they believed in it.
And Grove went with them.
Right from day one. He's part of the founding team.
And initially, Intel focused on memory.
Yeah, DRAM, short-term memory. That was the initial plan.
But then came the microprocessor, almost by chance.
Well, a request from a Japanese calculator company in 1969 changed everything. It led them to develop the 4004.
The world's first commercial microprocessor.
Exactly. The key thing was its programmability. It wasn't just for one task. You could program it for different things. That laid the groundwork for the CPU.
And it was small, affordable, but powerful for its time.
Absolutely. Mass-producible, relatively cheap, and could do like 60,000 operations per second. Amazing back then.
The podcast shared a little story about Noyce, maybe showing a bit of ego.
Oh, yeah. Apparently, at his parents' 50th anniversary, he pulled out the silicon chip and basically declared how it would change the world. Strong self-belief, let's say.
So Intel quickly saw microprocessors were bigger than just calculators. Computers were next.
Right. The Altair 8800, one of the first personal computers, used their tech. Then came the 8088 and 8086. Huge for the PC era.
And their strategy was different from competitors, focusing more on commercial uses.
Yeah, they targeted corporate computers, calculators, consumer goods, not just government contracts. That higher volume from the consumer side really helped drive Moore's Law, push costs down.
Plus, computers were shrinking.
Exactly. Needed smaller chips. It all fit together.
Still, it's worth remembering the Pentagon's early role, right? Funding a lot of this initial tech.
Definitely. The podcast points that out. While Intel's massive growth, 2 employees to 15,000 in a decade, showed the shift to commercial, that early DoD funding was critical groundwork.
Okay, now we enter the Andy Grove leadership era. President in 79, CEO in 87. He steered them through some serious storms.
He really did. His tenure was defined by navigating crises that could have sunk other companies. The podcast highlights 3 big ones.
What was the first?
Late 70s. Cheaper, high-quality memory chips flooding in from Japan. Big threat.
How did Grove handle it?
His first move was unconventional. Asked employees to work 2 extra hours a day, unpaid, to avoid layoffs.
Wow. Did it work?
Well, alongside that, they launched a new chip, the IAPX 432, which actually bombed. It was way slower than competitors. Complex design.
So a double whammy.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
But it forced Grove to make a tough, crucial call. Intel had to get out of the memory business, focus almost entirely on microprocessors.
That must have been wrenching, shifting away from their original core product.
Hugely difficult.
Yeah.
But Japan was just dominating low-cost manufacturing then. Competing on memory was looking like a losing battle. It was probably survival.
Okay, Crisis 2. The rise of the PC in the early 80s. But this was more of an opportunity for Intel, right?
Oh, absolutely. They were perfectly positioned. Their microprocessors were in like over 80% of PCs.
This is the Wintel era starting.
Exactly. Windows from Microsoft, Intel inside. That combination just dominated personal computing. And Intel locked it down with patents on their microprocessors, created a near monopoly.
But even with that dominance, they hit another snag. 1994, the Pentium flaw.
Ah, yes, the floating point bug. Big PR nightmare. Initially, Grove and the engineers were a bit dismissive, said it wouldn't affect most people.
Which didn't go over well.
Not at all. Huge public backlash, media frenzy. But Grove turned it around. launched this massive PR and marketing campaign.
And it worked.
Amazingly well. He didn't just fix the problem. He made Pentium a household name, a desirable brand. Masterful recovery.
So looking back at that whole successful run, what were the key ingredients according to the analysis?
Several things. Brilliant people, obviously, but also egos seemed relatively in check, allowing for teamwork, real visionary thinking, creating markets, not just serving them, and understanding those core tech trends. Smaller, cheaper, faster.
Sounds like a recipe for lasting success.
It really did. Intel just dominated through the 90s and into the 2000s. Leader in PCs, leader in servers, the backbone of the internet. August 2000, their market cap hit $300 billion.
Which is like $500 billion today, the most valuable company in the world back then.
Exactly. Which makes the contrast with today pretty stark.
Right. Fast forward to, say, early 2025 in the podcast timeline. Intel at $85 billion, while Microsoft, Apple, Nvidia are in the trillions. Even TSMC at over $800 billion. What happened?
The analysis boils it down to a couple of main things. First, just the difficulty of staying on top. When you dominate, there's often only one way to go. Market share-wise, it can make you defensive.
And the second?
Failure to really catch the next big waves, specifically mobile computing and AI. And related to that, clinging too tightly to their own manufacturing.
Okay, let's unpack those. The mobile and AI myths first.
Right, so smartphones take off in the 2000s. Huge shift. But Intel and Microsoft were kind of caught flat-footed. Windows needed bigger screens, more power. Intel's chips back then were power hogs, not great for batteries.
So who filled the gap?
Companies like Qualcomm, Samsung, using ARM-based designs, they just nailed the low power requirements for mobile. Google making Android free didn't hurt either.
And then Apple made that huge move.
Dumping Intel for their Macs, designing their own chips, getting TSMC to make them. That was a massive signal to the market. Intel wasn't the default choice anymore.
Meanwhile, Nvidia was doing what?
Nvidia really leaned into their graphics expertise, GPUs, perfect for AI later on. And they went fabless designing chips, but outsourcing the manufacturing.
Which gave them more flexibility?
Yeah, much faster design cycles, quicker prototyping. And in AI, Moore's Law almost started working against Intel in a way. AI models were helping design the next generation of AI chips, accelerating things even faster where Intel was already behind.
Okay, the second big factor, sticking with manufacturing. This ties into the recent CEO, Pat Gelsinger.
Very much so. Gelsinger is an Intel veteran and Andy Grove protege. Actually worked on the 4004 way back when. He came back as CEO in 2021.
Kind of a make Intel great again narrative.
Yeah, there was definitely that feeling. Semiconductors were becoming super important geopolitically, economically, and the sense was Intel had fallen behind.
So what was his big plan? And why didn't it quite work, according to the analysis?
Two main reasons cited. Still betting heavily on internal manufacturing and, well, the inertia of Intel's corporate culture.
Because designing chips and manufacturing them are really different beasts, right? Need different skills, huge investments.
Totally different. Gelsinger's plan was ambitious, even disruptive. Not just make Intel's own chips, but become a foundry, like TSMC. Build chips for other companies too. Create an internal TSMC, basically.
But the podcast questions if Intel, built for its own needs for decades, could really pull that off effectively.
That's the core critique. Gelsinger knew it was risky long-term. Got board approval, huge investments lined up, helped by the U.S. GPS Act, trying to bring manufacturing back.
But the goal was huge, right? Second biggest contract manufacturer by 2030. Starting from zero.
Immense goal. Facing TSMC and Samsung, who've been doing this forever, convincing Apple or Qualcomm to switch. Really tough sell. A company built to serve others is just structured differently than an integrated giant like Intel.
And there was that failed attempt to buy Global Foundries.
Yeah, that reported $30 billion deal fell through. Then you had the pandemic boom for PCs, which gave a temporary boost, but then a downturn hit. Key execs started leaving.
And changing that deep-seated culture.
Always incredibly hard. Overcoming internal resistance to such a massive shift. The irony, the podcast notes, is, despite all this, Intel still has like 60% of the PC chip market.
So the question becomes, did the board pull the plug on Gelsinger's plan too soon, before it had a real chance?
That's the lingering question the analysis leaves us with. It was always going to be a long haul.
Let's look at the numbers now. The recent performance picture isn't pretty.
No, it's quite stark. The podcast notes that when Gelsinger started, Intel and Nvidia had similar valuations. Now, Nvidia's multi-trillion. Intel's lost maybe $150 billion in value.
Stock price down massively.
Over 60% in the last year, mentioned in the source. 50% in the most recent 12 months they reviewed. Biggest quarterly loss in history reported recently, too.
Wow. There were even rumors about Qualcomm trying to buy them.
Yeah, rumors floated, though Intel's sheer size makes that complex. And now, the CEO's departure is widely expected. Finding a replacement.
Tough.
Why tough? Well, an outsider faces a huge challenge changing that entrenched culture. An insider might lack the radical vision needed. It's a difficult spot.
And Nvidia taking their spot in the Dow Jones Index, that's symbolic?
Hughes is symbolic. Really shows how the industry sentiment has shifted.
What's Intel saying officially through all this?
The usual corporate language, really, acknowledging a tough patch, focusing on long-term foundations, efficiency, agility, confidence they'll survive, but not many specifics beyond Gelsinger's plan, which now seems uncertain.
Okay, so wrapping this up, here's something for you, our listener, to chew on. Given everything Intel's history, its current struggles, is getting acquired maybe the most realistic path forward.
Yeah, think about it. Who would make sense? A design company like Nvidia, a manufacturing giant like TSMC, maybe even someone smaller but strategic like Qualcomm.
What would any of those moves mean for chip innovation, for competition? A lot to consider about the future of this foundational company. Definitely something to think about.